All right, really interesting stuff, I think. Really fascinating to do this. Okay, so our goal in the next small segment is to give you some additional resources, but also an approach to teaching with two different kinds of web mapping applications. One of which is the Urban Observatory, and the other one is the International Migration Data Set. Okay, so back on our outline, there is a line in there that says Teaching with Web Mapping Apps, Urban Observatory, and then this second one. Let's start with the Urban Observatory. So if you go to the outline for our 2 days together, go ahead and click on Urban Observatory, okay? Yeah, and if you can't find it, just do a little Control F in there and search for Urban Observatory. Are we good?
Yes, they are ready for you.
Oh, great. So once you click on Urban Observatory, it's urbanobservatory.org. Okay, so Urban Observatory, and you see where it says Start Comparing right in the middle of the screen there? Yep, go ahead and start comparing. You're going to get something that's kind of similar to what we've been looking at, only that in this case, we're going to be able to look at, as the name implies, cities across the world. There are about 100 cities in the list that you can compare here with this tool, and you've got about 55 variables in those 100 cities. And so it opens with a, as you can see, population density for New York, London, and Tokyo. So even on here, as you pan around, notice that it's all connected to this ArcGIS Online platform. So you actually have the capability of panning and zooming. And you're looking at population density in New York, London, and Tokyo. So if this is a supplement to your lesson on how cities formed and the form that cities have, and the constraints of physical geography, especially in the case of New York and Tokyo, right, being on adjacent to major bodies of water that influences where people have been able to settle. Well, let's say now that we want to change what we're analyzing. So let's say we are teaching about population, and let's say you show your students a population pyramid, right? So showing them age and the age breakdown for different countries with population pyramids. And then you said, okay, let's take a city in each of those countries and let's have a hypothesis on where, for example, senior population is going to be high and where senior population is going to be low. Well, if they've looked at population pyramids for, let's say, Japan versus a place like Ghana, then the population pyramids are going to look radically different, right? There's a lot more senior population in Japan than there is in Ghana, in part because of the higher birth rate in Ghana and the population pyramid looking different. So if we go to cities across the top there, first of all, let's say you've got some students that they have no idea where these cities are. So you might have to have a separate map in a different tab to have them look for a city in each one of these countries. Or you can just pick them. But I always like the students to know where these cities are. So if I scroll here, I've got cities. I don't have to take New York, London, and Tokyo. I could say, ooh, I want D, and I can look at Delhi. And maybe I want Delhi in the left panel. See, I can change, and now I'm looking at population density. Now I've got Delhi in the left panel, and London and Tokyo. See, so I've got some capabilities of changing this. I don't have to just teach about those three cities, and I also don't have to teach about population density. So on the left side, under themes, let's go ahead and change the theme, and let's scroll down to under people, where there's senior population. So instead of population density, let's change it to senior population. And again, if this is part of your lesson on looking at age breakdown between countries and why it's different, then let's go ahead and say, okay, I'm going to change this. Now I've got senior population, and let's say my city on the left panel, I don't want Delhi, I want, how about Accra? So Accra's in Ghana, and if I look at Accra versus Tokyo, which is still on the right side, I can see that my hypothesis was confirmed. In other words, looking at the population pyramid for Japan, right, there's a lot more older people. So that population pyramid, I won't take time to show it, but as you are probably visualizing, the population pyramid for Japan is like a rectangle, right? You've got as many older people pretty much as you do kids in school age. So it's almost like a rectangle. But in Ghana, it's much more like a pyramid, where you've got the base of the pyramid or the triangle being really wide at the bottom. In other words, there's a lot of kids and not very many old people. And that shows up in this map that you're drawing right here, right? So your hypothesis was confirmed. And oftentimes when I teach with these tools, I have the students think about what's my hypothesis of how this map is going to look once I draw it? And in this case, hopefully, with a little bit of background from you teaching about population pyramids, they will say, oh, my hypothesis is confirmed. There are fewer seniors. So the density here, looking at, as you can see below the maps, the map layers show a dot distribution to represent the population. So instead of having a continuous tone, it's a dot density map. So one dot represents a number of people age 65 or over in that area. So if you've got a neighborhood scale, it's going to be 3 persons per dot. At this scale right here, it's basically 100 persons per dot. Same thing with Japan. So based on that, it's got the same density here well, we've got the same scale, but the density is much different between Tokyo and Accra, right? There's a lot more senior population. So coming back now to our whole statement about what's where, why is it there, and then why should we care? Well, what implications does that have, right? So if you've got a city with a lot more older people, you're going to have to plan different kinds of services, right, in those cities, and get the students to tell you what those services might be. So in Ghana, right, if you've got a lot more kids, you're going to need a lot more schools, right, for one thing. So lots of implications here and things that you could discuss in the class. Now, one more thing on this Urban Observatory tool, and that is, let's think about one of the notes in the outline for today and tomorrow is this whole idea of crowdsourcing. So ordinary citizens collecting data, and that could be you and your students. It could be motorists on a highway. It could be people going out and collecting species on birds, right? Who knows birders? I mean, they're very passionate about the species, the tree name, the color of the wings, etc. So there's lots of crowdsourcing going on, and much of that gets fed into these modern geotechnologies, which is actually pretty exciting. So if we look at something like traffic, this touches on a lot of different things. So let's change the maps now to something like, how about, I'm going to go to A, I'm going to change it to traffic on the left, and I'm going to go to, I'm going to scoot this over, and I'm going to go to, well, you can do anything you want, folks. You've got the capability, you've got the power at your fingertips. I'm going to look at Atlanta, and then I'm going to look at Auckland, and I'm going to put Auckland in the third panel, and I'm going to put, maybe go to L and go to Los Angeles. Again, feel free to do whatever city you want. Los Angeles, and I'm going to put that in the second panel. So now I've got Atlanta, London, and Auckland. Now, here's, to me, what's kind of exciting about this. There's so many spatial and temporal things you can get the students to think about. In the very basics, though, let's say I'm teaching 5th and 6th grade. What pattern do I see of the freeways in these places? And what's the constraint of landforms? Like in the case of Auckland, right, you've got everybody funneling through basically these 2 bridges, right, because Auckland's on this sort of isthmus. Get them to think about what an isthmus is, between two bodies of water, right? So it's on the North Island of New Zealand. If they didn't know that, they could zoom out and see the general layout. But Atlanta, you've got fewer physical constraints. Los Angeles, you've got that constraint of the Pacific Ocean off to the west and southwest. Well, where does this traffic information come from? That's another topic you can teach. There aren't little traffic monitors every few hundred feet along every highway, right? It's all from people's cell phones, right? It's fed into for example, if you're looking at a Google map of traffic or a map like this, an urban observatory, the fact that you've got 50,000 people moving at 10 miles an hour, it's going to show up in red because it's tracking those cell phones moving slowly across central Los Angeles. So get the students thinking about data that's actually being uploaded just by virtue of people's phones being on. So that's another thing you can touch on. The other thing I love touching on is thinking about the world and the time zones, right? So if this is current traffic, what time is it in Atlanta right now, right? And is it a weekday? So right now it's 11 o'clock-ish Mountain Time, right? So it's 1 o'clock Eastern Time. And have them pull up a time zone map so they can know that Atlanta's 1 o'clock. And okay, I zoom in. I can see that, it's actually moving fairly well in Atlanta right now, all things considered, right? Free flow, green. Los Angeles, right? It's 10 Pacific. So you still got some congestion. In Auckland right now, it's actually flowing pretty well. So if I did this, it's 5:13 in the morning on Saturday in Auckland, right? So that makes sense. There's not that many people on the road right now. And so you've got this nice touch point with time zones, with physical geography, with this whole crowdsourcing notion. And if you've got 5 minutes in the classroom, you may not have time to touch on all those things. But just the ability to pull up the data sets at your fingertips could be really powerful. Now, we've only touched on a couple things here. A, density of population. B, senior population. And C, traffic. There's a lot more you can analyze in here. The Urban Observatory was created by Esri and Richard Saul Wurman, whom you may know is the creator of the TED Talks. So they got together and said, we need a tool for people to plan and to be able to analyze cities in a compelling interface. And also, back on the crowdsourcing, have the ability of cities around the world to be able to upload their own data. So cities can contribute to this. It's not constrained to the cities that you see here. If other cities wanted to contribute, they could. As you can see here, El Paso is actually one of the cities. So if we looked at El Paso now, in the middle panel, it's what, 11:15 in the morning there? And also, of course, it's affected by the number of people in the area, right? You've got a lot more people in Atlanta than you do in El Paso. Nevertheless, right near downtown right now, it's going pretty slowly. As you can see, there's a red segment of I-10 that's going very slowly, stop and go. Okay, so this is a good tool. I think it's not something, again, that you would use maybe every day or every week, but it's something that's global and it covers a lot of different themes in a lot of different cities. Questions, comments? Interesting? I love this. I get all geo-teary when I see stuff like this. All right, one more. And that is, if we go back to and I'm hoping you're not getting too frustrated by just a small number of minutes on each one of these tools, because remember we said at the beginning, we're just going to plant some ideas. And you now know about the Urban Observatory, for example, and you can say, oh, I can go out and do my own investigation with my students. And I know the Urban Observatory exists. I know a little bit about what it does, and I can run with it. So any one of these tools we could actually spend hours on, but alas, we just don't have time. But on that same sentence in the outline, okay, there is this global migration trends link. I'd like you to go to the same line that we pulled up the Urban Observatory from and go to the Global Migration tool. Now, in keeping with our theme of, okay, where's the data coming from? Who made it? What scale was it created at? This first screen, I think, is important to spend a little bit of time on with your students. It's from the International Migrant Stock, as you can see there, the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs. So you've got 232 countries, and you've got 4 different timestamps, 1990, 2000, 2010, and 2013. So basically like a 25-year period-ish of migration trends. Now, like a lot of data sets, right, it's very useful, but it's not perfect. So you might bring up with students, you know, not every country has a census. And even those that do, people are missed, people are undercounted, some people are overcounted, right? So there are challenges, but nevertheless, the UN Department of Economic and Social Affairs has estimated, using some statistical techniques, right, the number of migrants to and from different countries. So this is not perfect, but it could be very useful in your classrooms. And one of the things that I love about it is that you've got some really neat cartography where the countries, you may have noticed in that base maps that we were changing in Kilauea and elsewhere, the base maps, one of the choices was a dark gray base map, okay? And that's what we're using for this one, the dark gray base map. That way we can really highlight migration and sort of mute physical features, right? We really don't care about mountain ranges and valleys and so on in this kind of a situation, right? We really are interested in to and from countries in different time periods. Another reason why I wanted to show this is to get you thinking about, you know what, I'm not constrained to 2D maps. It's a 3D world. It makes sense that we have 3D tools at our fingertips. Same thing here. Now, as you can see, the map starts with sort of an animation that plays. And once you've run through the animation, which you can stop at any time with the stop button in the lower left, let's do the following. Let's look at, I'm going to start with Australia. Okay, so in the country list in the left side, you can pick the country. Now, you being the creative educators that you are, you don't have to do exactly what I'm doing, okay? You can say, you know, Joseph, I don't care about Australia. I want to look at another country right now. That's perfectly fine. It's your workshop, okay? Now, in the case of Australia, since it's kind of, you know, isolated in some ways, it's really hard to sort of look at it. I mean, I can kind of see the pattern. I got this really thick line from the UK and get the students thinking about, you know, how was Australia settled? Well, the Aboriginals were down there, the Aborigines, right? The native people were down there for centuries, thousands of years, even millennia. And then it was settled by largely Western Europeans, especially UK people, right? Ireland, England. And so it makes sense that there's this thick line of inbound. There's still a lot of people from the UK that move there. It also makes sense that there's a fairly thick line over to New Zealand, right? Same language, settled by largely the same group of folks. But get them thinking about, hey, who were the first non-Indigenous settlers in Australia? Who went down there back in the 1700s? Prisoners, right. So convicts, yeah, exactly. So get them to think of, have a little anchoring in, depending on what country you're going to investigate with the students, get them to do a little investigation of how that country was originally settled and so on. Now, in this case, in Australia, since it's kind of isolated, I actually do like the 2D view a little bit better. So in the lower left, there's a little thing that looks like a sandwich almost. It's basically a set of map layers. You can toggle between 2D and 3D. So in this case, again, your preferences may vary, but I kind of like the 2D view a little bit better just because it's easier for me to visualize where people are coming from and to. Now, one example of how you could teach with this is show the students an article about how the immigration to Australia has changed. So in the 1990s, it was still largely reflecting what you had in the past, where you got a lot of immigration from the UK. And interestingly, and this is one of the things I love about maps, is that sometimes they really challenge our expectations or our hypotheses of what we think is the way the world works. Because, you know, when I look at this, I think, gosh, I didn't realize there were so many people from the Caribbean that moved to Australia. But there are. Look at that. There's some fairly thick lines in there. So not only do you have, so you could show the students this article and they could investigate and reflect upon it, how the immigration has changed. So over time, as you probably know from being educators, it has changed largely from, not largely, in part, from its traditional, you know, Western Europe incoming. Now you've got a lot from India. You've got a lot from China, Bangladesh, etc. So there's a lot more immigration from Asia, which then again, we think of the, so what? Well, that changes the cultural makeup. That changes issues. That changes political geography, etc. So you can go across the bottom and see how things have changed over time. Now, knowing that, we can also switch in the upper left to outbound. So where do people actually move from Australia to elsewhere? And you can see if you hover over these different countries, you can compare other countries inbound and outbound. So Australia, for example, you've got inbound 6 million, outbound 483,000. So a little bit of math integration. How much more is inbound versus outbound? So is it net immigration or net emigration? Get students to do a little bit of math here. So as you can see across the bottom, you've got some raw numbers. Global migrants, in this case 2013, 224 million. Migrants from Australia, countries from and to. Then I'd like to compare it to a place like Somalia. So let's go to Somalia. If your students were looking at Somalia, and I'm going to look at inbound. So you can see that the amount of inbound in according to 2013, again, according to this data set, was pretty small, right? I'm going to make my window just a little bit smaller. 2,000, okay? And they're only from these countries. Again, according to this data set, it's really important to keep saying that. We could have other data sets that we compare to the UN migration. Now get the students to think about, okay, once we've studied Somalia a little bit, what comes to mind? What would you teach about? So after you teach, yeah, exactly. After you teach this, you could have a hypothesis, and hopefully your students would have a hypothesis that after you've taught about some of the challenges that Somalia has had, right, over the past decades, ranging from food security to political instability and so on, then your hypothesis should be, well, there should be more outgoing than incoming. But then, you know how students oftentimes see things as either A or B and there's no middle ground? You know what I mean? Even adults, right? So oftentimes students will say to me at this point, well, if it's that challenging there, why doesn't everybody leave? And then dig into, well, what are the constraints? A, sense of place and connection to family, right? If your whole family is in a place, how bad does it have to be before you're going to leave? Like, get them to think about, okay, their own personal situation. Let's say there's a number of challenges in the USA, right? How bad does it have to get here before they would actually leave? And then the second thing you could talk about, and by no means are these the only things, right? But the second thing you could talk about is financial constraints, right? Just because you could leave doesn't mean you have the ability to leave, right? And again, thinking about your family, do you want to leave your whole family behind and get out of there? There are other compelling reasons for you to stay. So as you can see, there are lots of gray areas that we can talk about here. And sure, there are actually people that move there from other countries. There's, of course, a lot more outbound. Now, closer to home, if we looked at the USA, maybe some of you are actually doing that, and looking at where people actually move from the USA to where? Well, they move to the UAE, they move to Saudi Arabia, they move to Western Europe, right? Some move to Canada. So There, according to the data set that we're looking at, 164 countries were destination countries. The inbound, it looks like 214. So more countries sent people here than we sent people to, or they decided to move to. From, according to 2013, looks like 3 million-ish. Inbound, 45 million. Okay, so again, you know, what's fascinating to me is that you look at some things that kind of make sense. Ask the students, hey, who knows someone from India? Who knows someone from Argentina or Chile, right? You've got a lot from Chile in here in India, but then there's some things that are really unexpected. Reunion Island. You know, I don't know if this is one of the reasons, but as you know, as you may investigate with the students, that is one of those countries that is highly susceptible to sea level change, right? So I don't know if any of it has to do with climate-induced exodus or if it's some other reason, but that would be something to investigate. You know, based on this, there's a lot of people that moved to the U.S. from Reunion Island. Fascinating. That's not something I would have expected. And as you might expect, right, especially living in your area, there's a lot of inbound from Mexico. And there's also a lot of outbound. Yep. Fascinating to be able to look at this, right? So inbound to Mexico, a million people moved there in 2013, 13 million people left, right? So you can hover over any of these countries and get more of the information. Just really interesting. You've got math, you've got geography, you've got some political science that you could talk about. We just talked about maybe climate induced migration. You could talk about water, political instability, and a lot of different things here. Space and time integration. There's also one for states, which we don't have time to dig into, but I can also, I can send the link to Ms. Duran and Dr. M and others. But what do you think of this? Uh-oh, the bell's ringing. You guys have to bolt? That's all right. Well, thanks, folks. I think this is one of those tools that is compelling. It's useful. It's in a web browser, and it also shows the ability to do 3D visualization inside ArcGIS Online with something called, as we'll dig into later, the 3D scene viewer. So again, like I was talking about at the beginning of the day, maybe you don't teach about migration, but maybe you teach about earthquakes or tornadoes or population change, or your language arts teacher, you're teaching about characters in certain novels, you know, Jane Austen, Charles Dickens, you know, etc. Right? Different novels. You could do this kind of thing where you're looking at where the characters are from, where they migrated to during the novel, etc., with a 3D scene viewer like this. So lots of different implications here, and good solid content, some web mapping tools to supplement maybe what you're teaching. Questions, comments, issues? Oh, you folks are the best. You're the real heroes, people. I mean, none of this would be any, your role is, let me just say this, and I promise to be quiet. Your role is really critical here, right? Because these, you're the ones that are framing some of the really key questions. Now, of course, you want the students to start asking their own questions, but you're the one that's really getting them to think spatially and investigating. Otherwise, these tools are just sort of fancy graphics, in my opinion, right? You're the ones that's bringing them to life by really digging into what's behind the scenes and why this all matters. So I really think your role is critical. Don't get too stressed about knowing exactly where buttons and tools are, because, you know, the students will be able to help you with that part. You know, they're not shy in clicking around on stuff. So it's kind of in a techie sense, as Ms. Duran probably can relate to you all, that it's sort of a, you're learning together the techie part, but your role is so critical in my view, because you're the instructor framing the question and really structuring the investigations. So anyway, kudos to you all. Oh, you're teaching human geography? Oh, very cool. I know, they're digging into the tools, and that's what we want them to do. So we're not going to force you to make comments, but wish you all the best. I will talk with you tomorrow. I know you're going to get ready to go out into the field, and I wish I could go out in the field with you because I love field work. But again, map on, folks. You're doing great work.
Okay, thanks so much, Kate. Ano isso?
No, you, vous, ustedes.
Okay.
Hasta mañana.